Pray help us, we are starving, none can our suffering tell. God only knows the anguish that in our hearts does dwell. Pray help us, we are starving.
The Lancashire Cotton Famine ran from 1861 to 1865 and was caused by the American Civil War and the North blockading all exports from the South, and that was largely cotton. 80% of the cotton that was worked in the mills of northwest England was grown in the southern states of America, in the Confederate States of America. So when that stopped in 1861, they ran out of raw cotton very quickly, and many people were made unemployed and lots of people put on short time. There were approximately 2,500 mills working cotton in the region. This was the hub of the Industrial Revolution. There were maybe about 430,000 people working in the cotton mills. Very soon it became a serious economic situation that affected eventually millions of people. What we haven't really heard is what ordinary people thought about that.
Lancashire people took to verse to express the devastating impact the American Civil War had on their lives.
Cotton famine poetry is largely poetry that was written into newspapers. Most towns had at least 2 newspapers, and nearly all the newspapers had a poetry column. Sometimes they wrote directly about the cotton famine, sometimes they wrote about the American Civil War. They were interested in the issues of slavery, but they also interested in when the cotton was going to come back, if the cotton was going to come back.
Cotton lords, lords of creation, feed the slaves which made your wealth.
From 2015, Dr. Simon Rennie of the University of Exeter, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, began to collect hundreds of these poems. The aim was to create a publicly accessible database of cotton famine poetry. He also began a collaboration with traditional music group Faustus to bring the poems back into the oral tradition.
They look for lyrics written by working people that have been turned into folk songs. I look for the lyrics of working people that have been turned into poetry. And the connection between poetry and song was much closer 150 years ago. So we recognised that to some extent our missions were similar.
Benji and Saul and I were completely unaware of the Lancashire Cotton Famine until we did this project. So it's been a very sharp learning experience there, and we've discovered not only this incredibly important and distressing part of English social history, but we've discovered a whole world of poetry that we didn't know existed.
Stop each loon, war is raging in the States. The cotton tree twice yearly blooms.
Faustus have tried to focus on songs both from working people and songs with some form of social message. So the cotton famine poetry fits into that very neatly.
The performance of poetry, the live performance of poetry, is important because that's what it's written for. It's a composition for the human voice.
We're quite used to taking old texts and setting them to new music, particularly if we don't like the original music to which the text was set. But in the case of the cotton famine poetry, there are no set tunes, or if there are, they've been lost. So we had quite a blank canvas when it came to musical composition.
Cotton Lords is a really interesting poem because it wasn't published in the poetry column, it was published as part of an editorial and then used as an example of the kind of poetry that they wouldn't publish. Cotton Lords is a very angry poem as well. What that example gives us is a window into the kinds of poetry that was being written.
Cotton lords, lords of creation.
I love Cotton Lords because of the sarcasm behind it. There's a sort of sarcastic but righteous anger.
This not a Christian nation, who's conducive to their
Hello, my name is Jennifer Reid, the pre-eminent broadside balladress of the Manchester region. What does that mean? Dunno, made half of it up, but it sounds good, doesn't it?
Jennifer Reid brings the aspect of performance, particularly of dialect poetry and song in dialect. And there are very few people who can do that authentically, but Jennifer Reid is steeped in the traditions of industrial song and poetry from that period and in this region.
So this is the Cherat Weavers song. So when all this stuff was going on and we couldn't get that cotton either by choice or force, we were weaving Cherat, which came from India. So you know your posh Egyptian cotton that you get from John Lewis and people like me can't afford? It's really, really long, like the threads or whatever it's called. So then when you spin it, the thread's really nice because, you know, it's less chance of breaking. Whereas Cherat's really, really, really small. So then you try and twist it all together and you get breaks and it's just a nightmare basically. So then we ended up having to weave shoddy goods, so like dishcloths, tea towels, that kind of do. So that's where the word shoddy comes from. Damn it, I never saw woven afore. Me back's welly broken, me fingers are sore. I've been stirring and rooting among the Cherat till I've welly negating as blind as a bat. Oh dear, if you'd Yankees could only just see how they're clemming and starving poor weavers like me. I think they'd soon settle their bother and strive to send us some cotton to keep us alive.
Pray help us, we are starving, none can our suffering tell. God only knows the anguish that in our hearts does dwell. Pray help us,
The Lancashire Operatives Appeal, in a sense, is a kind of what we would call a 5-star Lancashire Cotton Famine song, because it covers all of the bases. It's clearly an appeal for charity, it's an appeal for relief. But it's also interesting that it's in a multiple voice. So it's please help us, we are starving. So it's inhabiting the voice of the generality of workers.
Soon there'll be no home for me, no place to lay my head, lay my head.
The sentiment behind Lancashire Factory Girl is really very powerful. It's an incredibly moving song about a young lady whose complete world falls apart. She loses her job, her family lose their jobs, they lose their possessions, and then her family, one by one, die. And she's left alone, clinging to her faith and taking comfort from the fact that she hasn't followed the path of prostitution, but she's kept her integrity, and that seems to be all she has.
All are gone, I've nothing more to pawn or sell for bread, and soon there'll be no home for me, no place to lay my head, lay my head. Oh, shame on the man being caitiff for Lord, who would have the bond frame and took a ringe at his word, and a man to be named, to strut like a lordling would stoop to be named. Oh,
Wrongs and Rights is an angry political poem. It reminds me of Chartist poetry from the generation before, directly political, radical poetry, creating a kind of moral dichotomy, wrongs and rights, and attacking the establishment and attacking the ruling class.
and rally for freedom with the cry, do us right. Our watchword, our motto, on to the fight. Our watchword, our motto, on to the fight.
Our bodies' lifetimes quickly are, e'en for them that live so long. So doesn't it seem sadly wrong for the healthy and the strong to give 3 whole years' pith and pride to rust and ruin blended, and raving on the loss beside? I would this war were ended. I would this war were ended.
I Would This War Were Ended is particularly interesting in its themes because it talks about slavery, it talks about abolition, and it talks about the thoughts of a Lancashire worker wishing the war would end so that the cotton would come back. It's written in heavy dialect and is one of the few poems that people actually already knew about that had been published during the Cotton Famine, because it's by William Billington, who was a famous Blackburn poet.
William Billington, he's like a Blackburn poster boy, Cotton Famine poet. And he used to have a pub, the Nag's Head I think it is. It's a Ladbrokes now in Blackburn Town Centre. And there's a story of, he used to get all the dialect people, or people that are interested in dialect in the 1850s, 60s, into this pub, and they'd all be there, and apparently it was a great melting pot of like quarrymen, and then like the chief of police would all go there and like discuss dialect. It was like a nice, imaginary, beautiful scene.
I found quite a lot of it incomprehensible, which intrigued me even further, so I got Simon to translate it. Again, there's an emotional connection there. It talks about a father trying to raise his family under dire circumstances. It's a song that also very succinctly encapsulates the politics of the time as well, so it works on several layers.
I think projects like this are fantastic because they bring a new audience and they allow people to access heritage and history and stories in a completely different way than they may have done before. Working with academics like Simon and working with bands like Faustus allow us to tell that story in a completely different way that we wouldn't have the skills and the experience to do, and that brings a new audience to both us and to that project and that story and that history.
They'd shut their mouth, for both of them's in the wrong, and it's...
I've absolutely loved this project, and I think Benji and Saul have very much enjoyed it too. It's been very inspiring working alongside Simon and his team, doing detective work, delving into these texts, finding new things. It's been an amazing project, and I don't really want it to end.